I now look to Leila Brillson to close the case for the proposition.
Can you hear me? Am I heard? Okay. I'm going to do a very masculine thing and correct the pronunciation of my name, which is Leila. So, last year, the Boy Scouts of America decided to allow girls into their ranks, which, as someone who was actually, true story, forcibly removed from the Girl Scouts of America for getting into a kicking war with another girl, I think that's pretty cool. Because this allows young girls who are more stereotypically boyish, rough and tumble, athletically inclined, interested in running and jumping and climbing trees, to participate in all of those masculine, boyish things. But in all of those think pieces and in all of that social conversation about this shift, I noticed something really remarkable. Not once did anybody ever suggest that maybe the Girl Scouts could be open to letting boys come in as well. And to me, this speaks volumes. And Martin, I was just thinking about the things that you were talking about, that men really want to feel like the successful elements of masculinity is to be successful and to win, to be able to provide for and protect, and to be in and respect power. But guess what? I want all those things too. So, because it's not men or maleness that need to be rethought, it's the word tradition and the archetype itself. The concept of traditional masculinity, which we've all been talking about tonight, has never actually been traditional. Gender has always been constructed by the forces around us, the notion that men are from Mars, women are from Venus, that sort of thing. Whereas the concept of sex, which is men have penises and women have vaginas, is relatively new to the social discourse. So what we consider traditional dominant masculinity is actually just, surprise, a bunch of crap we learned in Boy Scouts. And tradition dictates, and we're all talking about how we want to accept traditional masculinity, but the reality is tradition dictates and inherently says that tradition is not gender neutral. We can't redefine what has historically been in the past. So it is time for us to reject not men, but the modality of masculinity that defines itself as Wade said, a dichotomy, a binary, against other forms of being. This thing as opposed to that thing. Strength as opposed to weakness. Control as opposed to vulnerability. Masculinity as opposed to femininity. It's time to explode the societal box that men are placed into, which actually is an exercise that female-presenting individuals have gotten to do for a pretty long time. It's time for us to make some room for the sweeping concept of malehood, one that unites vulnerability with courage, and I'm going to get into those words a little later, and allows for those who want to be manly to interpret without tradition what the heck that means to them. Because guess what? We need men, now more than ever. So there's a lot of words here: traditional masculinity, toxicity, patriarchy. I'm going to dial it down for this discussion. When we consider traditional masculinity, is actually a prescriptive, descriptive, and aspirational set of traits that gender researchers have dubbed hegemonic masculinity. Somebody said, I think somebody used something close to that earlier.
What allowances would the speaker make for hormonal differences in the physiology of the brain, biological differences in general, which give rise to differences of behavior rather than just a sort of sociological narrative of prescriptive masculinity that we get fed in the universities?
I think that's a great question, and I will address that a little later, but I would like to say that if you look at the cutting edge of gender studies, and specifically the cutting edge of gender sciences, there are so many different biomes and ways that we express traditional masculinity. Have we been following the story of, oh my gosh, now I'm blanking on her name, of Castor Semenya. Castor Semenya is a cis woman who was born with more testosterone than her competitors, and as such, she's currently being penalized by the Olympic Association and the International Association for Athletes because she's just got too much testosterone. She's too manly. She's got to take drugs. We're okay with Michael Phelps being born as a swimmer, but a black queer woman, that's really weird, guys. Hegemonic masculinity. Hegemonic masculinity is a collection of characteristics that, when embodied correctly, makes one a man, a real man, and that a real man is allowed to endowed to dominate families, women, and other men. The word tradition assumes that there's an old guard and a new guard, instead of just there being power dynamics. Raewyn Connell, who you brought up earlier, whose research suggests that gender is a bit more than what kind of pants you wear, calls it this because it is a type of masculinity that legitimizes the male role as dominant, and anything outside of this is subordinate. And today, I'm going to propose it is not men who are toxic, but the traditional concept of masculinity that needs to be deconstructed. In fact, I'm going to make the claim that traditional masculinity doesn't even exist. Interesting anecdote. When I was pulling the thing about Raylan Connor, the gender studies, I kept seeing her referred to her and him and her and him, because I didn't have the idea that an academic could be a trans woman. So that's on me. But first, let's clear up a few misconceptions. There are a few things that get brought up when you discuss the goals of leveling traditional masculinity in order to discover something new. I'm not going to win over any hearts and minds in this room by saying, to borrow the parlance of 2019, that men are canceled. Men aren't the enemy. In fact, I love men. And when you talk about the systems that hold people in their social order, men are equally as affected as women. Who do we think is the most injured by the concept of traditional masculinity then that delineates men from everything else that isn't man, other than men? What happens when you are born into the male sex and don't fit this paradigm? I worked at the Lad Mag, Playboy. I was the first executive editor there for years, and first female executive editor there. And the interesting thing about that is that I did a lot of client meetings, and in those client meetings, there were only 2 advertisers for men: alcohol and automotive. That's it. Sometimes every now and then you'd get gambling. In female media, you get cinema, entertainment, wellness, mattresses, vacations, travels. That's because we do not conceive of men outside of this very rigid space. The second thing that I want to make clear is that men should not feel bad for being men. I consistently say men should only feel bad about being men when their maleness is dependent on its dominance over another. For the most part, it's men who are shaming men. Look at the words that are being used today: cuck, soy boy, beta male. That's all just about not being manly enough. That doesn't come from my side of the aisle. And the last thing is, feminism is harming men, and our goal is to turn the masculine into the feminine. As loaded as this is, I would also want to say that let's interrogate what makes the feminine feminine. But you know what? We do that regularly on Twitter, in media, at Beyonce concerts, and it's women who are leading this conversation. So I offer that to the male-identified people in this room. Lastly, let's talk biology. I'm going to read this because I want to get it right. Biological essentialism is a concept popularized and refined anytime there's a great leap forward between the rights between sexes. It suggests that traditional notions of masculinity and femininity come from nature, therefore following that men did hunting and fighting where women raised babies and tended to the fires. I'm going to quote that these exist in shoring up power and do not get their influence from being good science or science at all. The most cutting-edge science shows that the combination of protein expressions and the endocrine expression of hormones produce literally trillions of different possible combinations of expressed sexual characteristics, making the supposed absolutism of sex not only completely outdated today, but irrelevant in our modern understanding of sex and gender. So the thing is that we've heard a lot about the fact that men are killing themselves. And the problem is that the people who are most privileged are being held in this larger, overarching space that are telling them not to seek help. And it keeps we are seeing that, that the individual level psychological resources necessary to maintain male privilege aren't being given to those in power. The men who benefit from male privilege see themselves as politicians or historians or athletes are conditioned by that same privilege that restrict men's function to ability to function adaptively. Something is broken. And it comes down to whether you think that the issue is an encroaching framework of feminism that is somehow powerful enough to destroy years of tradition, or while not being able to elect women in, say, equal numbers or silence powerful men with choruses of voices, or if maybe there's an inadequate concept of masculinity that's not encompassing enough to hold all of the different male expressions. One of those options requires progress to stop, while the other one suggests that we evolve. And if we're talking about biology, the core truth is that you evolve or you perish. I want to just skip ahead because I'm running out of time to talk about something that doesn't have as much to do with masculinity and has to do with vulnerability, which is a very unmasculine thing. At my most current job, I got to see the shame researcher Brene Brown talk about there's nothing more vulnerable than being brave, and that bravery cannot exist without vulnerability. Vulnerability is uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. And if anyone in this room can tell me something that isn't brave or great, that doesn't include uncertainty, risk, or emotional exposure, I would challenge them to it. And we are not allowing men to be uncertain, risk their station in life, or expose themselves emotionally. Therefore, we are not allowing men to be brave. And we need brave men now, more than ever. As such, I would want you to support that the time for tradition is over.